Well, I guess thank you for everyone who is with us today for joining. We're excited to deliver our salary and job satisfaction survey data in the format of a webinar this year. So we're sort of keeping up with the new ways of working and everything being online these days, I guess. I'm Raha. I'm one of the senior recruitment consultants at OnQ, and I'll be going through the webinar with you today focused on the health economics and market access sector. And just to note, I will be using those terms interchangeably throughout. So I'm not only referring to one or the other, so it'll be all encompassing. The survey will have a general focus, or what we go through today will have a general focus on job satisfaction, mobility, recruitment across the whole industry. And then the salary data would be more specific to the health economics market access areas. And just some housekeeping items before we get started. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to type any questions that you have throughout the presentation. So you'll find that in a speech bubble icon at the top of the screen to access the chat function. I will try and respond to you or to respond to any questions in real time. Otherwise, I will come back at the end of the presentation as well if I don't get a chance to respond as we're going through. And please note that we will be recording this webinar, and a copy of the recording along with the report will be sent to everyone here today after today. So probably maybe tomorrow or early next week you should receive all that. So just to get started and just to give some context around our survey. So the survey was conducted around June, July this year. So if we think back to then, halfway through that, Sydney went into lockdown. So it's just helpful to keep that in mind when looking at the results and being aware of the headspace and environment in which the survey was conducted. We had over 1,000 contributors to the entire survey. And as you can see, the data comes from contributors working in all different size companies, from small companies to large companies. It comes from a general, split, even split of gender, somewhat even split, and also a mix of internationally owned versus Australian owned companies. The graphics you'll see here are from the full industry survey, but in market access, I guess we had 89% of the data coming from full-time employees, and the rest from part-time, and about 2/3 were female versus 1/3 female. And 70% actually worked for internationally owned companies. So slight variances compared to the rest of the industry, but quite consistent nonetheless. So this slide just shows that in regards to our market access contributors, over half have been in their role for between 1 to 5 years. Generally, it's not a sector we see very regular movement or candidates changing jobs like every other year or every second year, as perhaps we might see in other sectors. So just to give you an idea of, where the candidates are in their positions, where the responses have come from. So looking at salary or remuneration pay increases in the last 12 months, generally speaking, our sector in market access is well looked after financially. I mean, a lot of the success of a new product or asset for a company is tied to whether or not it gets listed for reimbursement. So usually these teams are paid quite well. Again, these graphics here are from the whole industry. However, to give you an idea of specifically market access, so 70% in market access received a pay increase in the past 12 months, and 40% of those increases were in the 3 to 4% range. So that's above the sort of standard 2% CPI, which is quite good considering that the 12 months prior to the survey, we were still in a COVID climate. There was concerns of pay freezes and how companies would actually go about pay increases and bonuses and things like that. The other thing to note, again, this is from the full survey, but in market access, those that didn't receive a pay increase, generally mostly were due to being just in the first 12 months of their role, and some of them were due to COVID pay freezes at the time. Interestingly, only about 53 or half of respondents who changed jobs actually received an increase when changing jobs. So that's quite interesting because everyone assumes that, they must get a pay increase when they change jobs. However, for those in market access who did get a pay increase, that increase was over about 30%. So it's quite high, and I would attribute that to being most likely due to taking another role in actually a high position. So rather than taking a sideways step. The average percent increase for the whole industry when changing jobs was under 20%. So again, market access is doing quite well. So in regards to bonuses, in market access, about 2/3 received a bonus in the past 12 months, which is again slightly higher than the rest of the industry as shown here. Typically the ones who did not receive a bonus again would have been in those first 12 months or might not have had a bonus component in their package depending on where they're working. Some companies perhaps don't do a bonus component. We often get asked about sign-on bonuses to change roles. So we've started to collect data on that in the past couple of years. In market access, none of the respondents who changed jobs actually received a sign-on bonus. But as you can see here, across the whole industry, about 10% did receive a sign-on bonus. So I wouldn't really read into it too much as to why there were no sign-on bonuses specifically in market access, because it's usually a very it's only offered in very unique circumstances and mostly for senior roles, particularly if the candidate is very close to the upcoming bonus and would miss out on that and would not be eligible for the next bonus in the new company. So that would be like a big period of time without a significant bonus. And also it's sometimes used as a way to increase the total package if there's no more room to move on base or another component of that package. So it's more of a ad hoc component, not necessarily a regular piece. Loyalty bonus here is really not relevant to market access, I would say. We captured it because we saw it more in other areas, such as CRO and clinical research industries, where there was more severe talent shortages for certain roles. So it's in there anyway. So looking at non-cash benefits, flexible working hours and work from home are always top of the list. The market access sector mostly offers this or receives it. So it's become quite a standard across the industry and probably more so since COVID. One thing to note is that professional development and further studies, so on the benefits most valued by employees, this has been quite consistent over the past few years in our survey. So if your company offers this, then it's certainly worth promoting when you're recruiting to the market. So moving on to some of the salaries in the health economics market access space. So this slide and the next slide are really just previews of the tables you'll receive in the report. I won't spend too much time going into the detail on the numbers, but we'll just go through it to give you an idea of what you're looking at and how to read the data. So first of all the figures shown here are total package excluding bonus. So that would include any base, car allowance and super, depending on what else is a guaranteed component of that package and not including bonus. Bonus you can see on the right hand side here in the column, just an average of what bonuses were received. This particular slide combines the data across all industries for each job title and it compares it to the previous year's data. There is the first quartile column, the median and the third quartile, and again, the indication of just the average take-home bonus for those job titles. So where there's some data missing, it means that we only received 1 or 2 responses for that job title. So there's not, obviously, we can't have a first and third quartile. And if there's a whole job title missing, then it just means there wasn't enough contributors in that space for that title. So for example, we don't have a line for health economics or market access associate. We only have the senior associate in here, unfortunately. I can see a question around whether this table refers to jobs in industry or also include academic government roles. So you'll see on the next slide that we do break it down by industry, and there is a component there for academic government roles. But again, we don't necessarily always gather data for every single job title in every single industry. It depends on what comes through in the survey. Just quickly on the right-hand side, there is a range for the car allowances, if that was relevant. But just noting that not all companies offer a car allowance for the same position in this sector. So that's why we try and capture total package for salaries rather than just base, because it does become then confusing. So the next slide here actually breaks each of those job titles down by industry. So it's the same job titles separated by industry. You can see there is an academia and government side, but we only collected that for the health economics analyst job title. We didn't get the same job title or other job titles in that same industry. For market access, we generally did get data across pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and consulting firms. That tends to be where most of the data comes from for us. It's interesting to see the big difference, I guess, between salary for a senior health economics or market access associate in devices versus the other industries. So I guess, yeah, if there's anything you see on here that you would like to discuss, more than happy to have a chat after the presentation, or pop a question in the chat function as well. I guess the other thing to note, so say with here, health economics market access manager, again, there's quite a range when it comes to these salaries. And I guess the thing to note there is to say that manager titles are always tricky to benchmark across the industry or the sector, because some companies have a manager titled position, even though there's actually no line like people management. And naturally, you would normally get a higher pay if you're responsible for people management. So a market access manager in a small company might be a standalone role where they're managing all activities, but not managing anyone else. In a larger company, there might be one of a few market access managers that just focus on therapeutic areas. And in another company, they might be managing actual associates or senior associates and involved from a more strategic perspective than a technical hands-on perspective. So all of these factors do contribute to where that person's salary might fall and how that company might benchmark their salary, even though it's the same job title across the industry. So it does make it quite tricky. So so I'll move on, but if you have any specific questions on salary, feel free to come back to me after the presentation, or if it's a general question, then happy to answer it in the presentation as well. So moving on to some of the employee experience components. So when it does come to leaving an employer, I think I've skipped a slide. So in market access, we have a generally satisfied cohort. Over 85% fall into that satisfied or very satisfied category. People are generally happy, they have high job security, they like what they do, they're very engaged, and this is the same across men and women. So really it's fantastic from a retention perspective that everyone's so engaged and loving their jobs, but it does make it more difficult for managers and companies when looking to recruit. So just something to keep in mind. So when it does come to leaving an employer, people left for more money, lack of job satisfaction, or excessive workload. We find that in market access, the lack of job satisfaction tends to be around seeking a company with a busier or stronger pipeline of upcoming molecules or assets for reimbursement. That tends to be the driver of a lot of candidates in that space. And the reasons to stay with a current employer are for flexibility, supportive management, and career development. So they tend to be the recurring themes in our survey year on year. It's quite consistent. I guess it's very difficult from a flexibility perspective. It's very difficult to make a change unless the next company is offering the same level of work from home and flexibility that you currently have, as most people have their family lives set up in a certain way and don't want to disrupt that. Looking at just a few slides on hiring. So if you're a manager, this might be relevant to you. So managers in the survey reported it was more difficult to retain talent in their market access teams in the previous 6 months. So keep in mind that was the first 6 months of 2021, where we saw some more movement in the market as COVID concerns sort of became a bit more elated. So that's that one. Interestingly, attracting talent was also a little bit more difficult, so not sure what that means. Usually that means, from what we saw, was the competitiveness in the market. So there might have been some candidates moving, but they had multiple job offers as well. So it was a bit more competitive in that space. Managers in market access also reported that obtaining permanent headcount was more difficult. And also obtaining contractor headcount for some was more difficult, some was easier. So I guess make of that what you will of that particular slide. In the next 12 months, managers in market access are telling us that they're planning to either keep their teams the same or have some increase in permanent headcount. So it's only a small sample size, but I guess, maybe there is some growth expected in the sector. And that would also go in hand with a need for more skills and resource. From a candidate's perspective, in market access, almost half of candidates are not looking to change jobs, and 1/3 are just sitting on the fence. So it's really only a small portion that would be actively seeking new roles. And 30% applied to a new job in the previous 12 months, which is slightly less than the rest of the industry, but I guess interesting nonetheless. Over 1/3 of market access received more than one job offer, so going back to that competitiveness in the market, and the demand for candidates. And generally speaking, we found with COVID, there were more jobs than active candidates. So it's not surprising that candidates would receive more than one job offer. And looking from a manager's perspective or a company's perspective in recruitment, across the industry, 1/4 of managers said that they had offered a job to someone who then declined the offer. And the reasons were predominantly around receiving either a counteroffer from their own company, or again, that competitiveness in the job market, they received another job offer from another company. Across the industry, the average time to fill vacancies was reported to be under 10 weeks. You could combine the sort of less than 5 and 6 to 10 weeks for most. But interestingly, in the market access pool, the responses showed it took about 11 to 15, like majority were in the 11 to 15 weeks to fill a vacancy. So 3 months to fill a vacancy is a very long time. I think most managers would say that that's way too long. They would need someone in the role a lot sooner. So these next few slides, again, you're going to get these slides in the report, so I won't spend too much time going into them in a great deal of detail. But basically in market access, 3/4 of candidates prefer a hybrid work arrangement rather than being entirely from home or entirely from the office. And managers report that they prefer to retain some control to decide on who works from home or what that setup looks like on a case-by-case basis. But the percentage of managers who have no preference on how their staff work has actually increased overall since the possibly that's because the pandemic showed that team engagement and productivity didn't really drop with work from home. And maybe this also was facilitated by a lot of companies investing in effective work from home strategies and processes and technology, as compared to pre-COVID, where it was much more basic, perhaps. So here's just the slide to show that the managers felt that overall team engagement and productivity have remained the same or actually increased. So we include this question in our survey just to see if that whole remote working during COVID has allowed managers to now consider hiring staff that are fully remote, say in a different city altogether. So traditionally, companies or managers tend to stick to looking for candidates in their own cities as their head office. But, we see this now coming up more often as a way to broaden the pool of candidates, or, reach a greater skill set, or, again, pool, and basically just looking for candidates in Sydney or Brisbane for a traditionally Melbourne-based role, or vice versa. And so pleasingly, almost 30% of managers say they would now consider employing remote-based staff. So a good opportunity for those who don't live in maybe a major city with a lot of company options to explore companies outside of their main city as well. So wellbeing at work, I guess this is just towards the end of the presentation, and just to touch on some of the mental health and wellbeing aspects of employment. Everyone is feeling somewhat stressed and challenged to keep up with their workload. Overwhelmingly, the responses we received focused on the lack of resource or staff to meet needs, and the need for companies to provide more resource to their teams. We see this even when it comes to hiring, where more and more companies and managers say they want the, hit the ground running type of candidate, who can already tick all the boxes and do the role pretty much with their eyes closed, rather than looking perhaps a little bit left of field and hiring someone with, great potential or really good transferable skills. I understand everyone is time poor and resource poor, so they feel they can't really afford that time to spend, training up someone who needs a little bit more support. But, I think that does make it more difficult for new people to break into the industry or the sector. And eventually that would create, bottlenecks or talent shortages down the track, I believe. So, yeah, so definitely the need for more resource to alleviate some of the workload there. And finally, just the last slide shows that at least, most people feel comfortable sharing their concerns around workload, stress, or mental well-being, and feeling unsafe. So sharing that with their workplace. I can see a question here. Did you see a difference in time to recruit between big and small companies, process versus agile? That's a really good point. I can go back and see whether the people who responded saying it took 11 to 15 weeks, I think it was, whether they were from big or small companies. That's a really good point. Sometimes the larger companies have, much more bureaucratic processes, but in my experience, it really comes down more to the market. So if it's taken a long time, and it has for some of the market access roles that I've recruited, it has been because it's a small pool. It's hard to find the right person, and perhaps if companies or managers are a bit more flexible on the criteria, that might have alleviated it. But when they're very specific on what they're looking for, it can take a while to actually get that person. Not everyone's looking. The other thing I would add, actually, on that note, I'll just move on to, that's the end of the presentation, by the way. So we're on to questions now. But the other thing I would just add on recruiting and timelines, in particularly market access, and this might be more so for the pharmaceutical space, depending on the payback cycles and things like that. There's a very clear sort of, the work is very project-based. There's very clear timelines. And often most candidates wouldn't want to leave right in the middle of a submission or preparing something, or, they would want to see something through and then leave. So depending on when that vacancy opened up, you might be waiting a long time before any candidates become active on the market, or even start considering changing a job, or being in that headspace. It could be the same in other sort of pockets of the industry as well, even in consulting, if you're working on a lot of projects. So I would attribute that more, like the longer timelines to recruit, to that, perhaps, than necessarily whether it's a matter of large versus small companies. But I think that's a really good question to look at, perhaps our whole survey data, and see anyone who did respond to, respond with a longer time to fill versus a shorter time, whether there were any trends around the company sizes there. And yes, so you've made a good point. Also, competitiveness with multiple offers due to small pool. Correct. So, you know, if you go through a recruitment process, you find your candidates, you interview, you offer, you that they give their notice and they start. That's a very quick process versus you get all the way through to the end with one candidate, and then they've accepted another job offer. You have to go back to square one. So you're kind of repeating the 3 to 4 weeks of that whole recruitment process all over again, including the search. And it does become then difficult when I'll just stop sharing my screen so you can so you can see me. It does then become difficult when it's only a small pool of candidates. So you don't want to be going back out to the same market, in a month's time and next month's time to say, oh, we're still recruiting, because the market, there's only so many people you're going to. So the market, doesn't want it's not helpful to I guess be seen as it's taking a long time to fill either. Often people then go, oh, well, what was wrong with it? Why hasn't anyone taken it so far? It's a bit of a catch-22 with that. But yeah, no, very, very good question there. So I guess, yeah, just to reiterate, that's the end of the presentation. So any other questions that anyone has, please feel free to type in to the chat function. And just a reminder that you will be receiving a copy of the whole survey report and this webinar as well, probably tomorrow or early next week, I would guess. And if you have any specific questions that you might want to explore with me directly, I'm happy to have that chat afterwards, or you can contact me on email or phone number as well.